This is lecture 4 of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we're talking about the historical backdrop in which the scrolls were written. So we're really going to get more of a flavor for what is going on in the world, and we're going to see if there is some direct correlation between the scrolls. Last week, we really looked at specifically the manual of discipline. So we're going to kind of take a larger picture view today about what is going on and causes, particularly the scrolls that are sectarian in nature, the scrolls that talk about the community, speak about the Dead Sea community the Qumran community directly. We're going to see what's going on in the greater Jewish world that is going to influence them. So this is some very, very basic context, and I know for some of you this is very repetitive, but I just very basic facts just to get a historical chronology here. So 586, the first temple is destroyed by Bavel or Babylon, and I just wrote Bavel instead of Babylon because it's shorter. I used the Hebrew. So the Jews, of course, are carried off into exile into Babylon. In 540, Cyrus the Great, the Persian, conquers the Babylonians, and he allows the Jews to go back and build a second temple, which begins in 520. These are all BC, before the Common Era. And around 450 before the Common Era, the biblical narrative ends. So what do I mean by the biblical narrative ends? If you look at, even if you go to, let's say, a table of contents in a Tanakh, a Jewish Bible, which has the not just the 5 books, but the entire Jewish biblical canon, you'll see the last book is Chronicles. It's always Chronicles. If you just flip to the end is 2 Chronicles. So there, that carries the story down to when Cyrus comes in and tells the Jews they could go back from Babylon and Persia, from Mesopotamia, go back to Jerusalem and go up like they're making Aliyah. It's a proto-Zionist type of text. They could go return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. So so as I said, that's around the year 540, 539. But if you look at Ezra and Nehemiah, which come before Chronicles, if you look at the order of the Tanakh, it carries the story a little later, till about 450 or so, when Nehemiah comes. He's probably comes around 444 or something like that. But that's when Nehemiah comes. There's a lot of debate as to when Ezra comes from Babylon back down to Jerusalem. Some say it comes a little earlier than Nehemiah, some say later, but we're talking about the year 450, so before the Common Era. That's where the narrative of the Torah ends. So any history, Jewish history, after that is post-biblical Jewish history. Now, just so we're not getting confused here, we do have the Book of the Maccabees, which narrates events which are much later, about 168 to 164 of the Common Era, a little before that. Gives you background. It gives you some background before 168, but that, as we've said, is in the apocrypha, the books that were not put in the Jewish canon that are put in the Septuagint, which is the Torah translated into Greek, and eventually that becomes the basis for the Catholic Bible. So that's not Jewish biblical history, even though you'll find that in a Catholic Bible. Okay, before we go on, to make something else clear, there were Jewish books still being added to the Jewish biblical canon much later than that, from anywhere between 90 of the Common Era, some people argue, until maybe even well after that, close to 200 of the Common Era. You have books like Daniel being added, and Esther being added, Shir Hashirim being added, are added much later than that 450 date. But as far as a narrative of Jewish history is concerned, that ends about the year 450 before the Common Era. And of course, now we get to the Greek influence. We get back to that slide. It came out all at once, but here it is. So what we have in the year in 331, Alexander conquers the Persian Empire. He sweeps through he sweeps through the Middle East as well. And we have a famous legend about the Torah being translated into Greek, which is the Septuagint we just mentioned before. This is about the year 250 before the Common Era. So what really happened, obviously, is Jews are living in particularly places like Alexandria, Egypt. They're speaking Greek. And just as when we open up a Chumash, the ones we usually have Hebrew and English. So here it's going to have Hebrew and Greek. We're going to have the Greek translation. So there's this famous story about how Ptolemy II, who is the Greek king of Egypt, he's ruling as a pharaoh, but he's really a Greek. He says, I need the Torah translated into Greek so we can read it as well. Remember, this is already a famous book. The Greeks were admired Judaism. So what he does, so what this is a legend, it didn't really happen, but the legend is he commissioned 70 rabbis to translate the Torah from Hebrew into Greek. They all do it separately, locks them in separate rooms. And when they come out, the translation is all absolutely identical. The idea it's a miracle that the Torah is so accurate, and the rabbi's understanding of the Torah is so accurate, is that this translation from Hebrew to Greek would be absolutely the same. Now, if you ask people, a bunch of people to translate the same text, people will sometimes use, even if they're not really changing the meaning, the people will use different words. That's only normal. But it's just making the point how strong the tradition of the Torah is. That's the point, really, of that story. And the more important point from a historical point of view is simply that the Torah needed to be translated into Greek because you have a lot of Jews speaking Greek at this point. And we spoke about some of this when I spoke about Hanukkah and the history. But in 198, the Seleucid, that's the Syrian Greeks, unlike the Egyptian Greeks, the Ptolemaic Greeks, talking about the Seleucid, the Syrian Greeks now, take control of Yehuda, or Judea, it's being called at this time. It had been controlled by the Ptolemies in Egypt. Now it's taken by the Greeks at the Battle of Panaeus. And as Professor Rendensburg, that's the other professor I'm using, the guy from Rutgers, as we've been calling him. I've been using his materials as well to prepare for this class. As he points out, Hanukkah is really, as far as we know, the first war fought for solely religious freedom in history. Now, you should keep in mind when we talk about religious freedom, religion and nationality were very, very highly mixed. We didn't have an idea of church and state as we do nowadays. So the two are clearly mixed. That you see earlier on in the prophetic books, like the Book of Kings, there are always religious political alliances going on. But here you really have a you have a turning point in history of people basically are saying, we don't like that our ability to practice religion is being abridged. As I spoke about in the Hanukkah class, it probably was really more of the Hellenized or the hyper-Hellenized Jews as opposed to the Greeks, who are really concerned about stopping Jews from practicing Judaism. But regardless, they don't like what's going on, and there's a war, and they're successful in the war. So the priesthood, what's also going to happen, and this is going to be important regarding the our Qumran sect here, is the priesthood is now being bought and sold. First, it's we have a guy named Onias who is the priest, but then his brother Jason buys the priesthood from the Seleucid or Syrian Greeks. The Greeks were short on cash because they had lost a major war to Rome and were paying Rome back. So this was a fundraiser of sorts for them. So they allow one Kohen to buy it from his brother. And this guy, Jason, basically turns Jerusalem into a Greek-style polis with the gym and all of these trappings you'd find in a Greek-style polis. To make matters worse, then Menelaus, who's not even a Kohen, or he's not even from the tribe of Levi, quite honestly, he's from the tribe of Benjamin, he's a Benjaminite, simply puts more money on the table and buys his way into the priesthood. So this is going to be a source of contention for our Qumran sect. This sect is going to see this as disgraceful, that someone who's totally unqualified to be serve as the Kohen HaGadol is, and it clearly is against Jewish law. They happen to be correct about this. Okay, so 164, we had the temple is liberated by the Maccabees. 152, Jonathan or Yonatan becomes the Kohen HaGadol. He's the brother of Judah the Maccabee. Judah was killed later on in fighting the Seleucids. Remember, when the temple is liberated in 164, they don't get rid of Seleucid control. There's a truce, and they're able to retake the temple. And it takes some years and years. It's not till about 130 or so of BC where they really gain true independence. Jonathan is basically, there's a great assembly comes, and he's basically appointed as the Kohen HaGadol, the high priest. And he's also the political leader of the people as well. He's not simply a priest here. This is, you don't have kings now. You had kings during the first temple period. You don't have kings. So the Kohanim, these priests, are really the de facto rulers of the people as well. It's possible that he's the wicked high priest who's mentioned in these Qumran sectarian sects. We don't know that for sure, but it's certainly possible because it's very clear that the Qumran sect is not happy with the high priesthood and the temple in Jerusalem, and he's really the one who takes charge after they liberate the temple. He's the one who becomes the leading Kohen HaGadol, the high priest, and the political leader of the people. So it's certainly possible. He was a very shrewd politician as well, Jonathan, or Jonathan. He's called Jonathan of a sly, which is kind of a backhanded compliment, complimenting him for his very shrewd political abilities. He was very successful in fighting Greek factions against each other to help put Judah on the road to independence. Okay, so what's happening now is, and we're going to talk about the sects, the different Jewish sects, more in depth next week. But the three big ones, as many of you know, are the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the Essenes. So the Essenes here arise as a movement because they are unhappy with the way the temple is being run now that it's in really Jewish hands again. Before, perhaps, when it was, you could be angrier with the very Hellenized Jews and the Greeks when they were running the show. But this is a period where the Essenes are saying, wait a minute, we don't have this foreign influence as well. The temple's in our own hands, but it's really not being run correctly. It's kind of like the Puritans, in a certain sense, would say, well, we have this church here, but we have to purify it. So they're not happy, and as we've already said, most scholars agree that the Qumran sect was a offshoot of, or a type of more militant type of Essene group. And Professor Schiffman points out, and he's really just connecting the dots here, saying that the Hasmonean and Maccabean revolt indirectly led to the founding of the Qumran sect, because the Essenes arise and they're not happy with what's happening with the temple when it's in Jewish hands. So therefore, you have this sect who's so unhappy that they, unlike other Essenes who are more a part of mainstream society, more urban type of Essenes who are interacting with the general populace, you have this group is so unhappy, they really, to a large degree, cut themselves off and set up this isolated and, as they would see it, very holy and pious community. And they disapproved of the contenders for the high priesthood. So as you had transitions for the high priest, they were always unhappy with the names which are being bantered around. You think about today, after a pope dies, it was 8-10 years ago that you had Pope Francis come in, and I remember also I'm sure you remember Pope Benedict before he was appointed. You have all these people jockeying for positions and the behind the scenes politics, which you have in any of these type of, I don't mean that in a negative way, that's just the way these things work. And they were always unhappy with the names of the people being thrown around and the candidates. Basically, they felt this was a group of people who are really unfit to fit the position. And again, you think about the Protestant Reformation, let's say, where Martin Luther is not happy with the Catholic Church. You have Alexander VI, Julian II, basically, who seem to be, to a large degree, interested temporal matters as opposed to spiritual matters. They're busy fighting wars. They say that Julian II, his favorite sound was not the church choir singing a hymn or a psalm of sorts, but it was the papal canon, because he always wanted to expand the papal states. And the Qumran sect rigidly believed that only the sons of Sadok or Zadok were Kohanim, and others were not legitimate. So they're really defining the circle of Kohanim as very small. The Kohanim, as far as they're concerned, should only be people who come from Sadok, who was the high priest during Solomon's time. So it wasn't enough to be from the family of Aaron. That family, obviously, by the time you get to Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, has already grown tremendously. So only one branch of that, they're saying, should be really serve as the Kohanim. And you even have Yehezkel talks about HaKohanim HaLevim B'nei Tzadok in the Haftarah for Emor, basically saying that the Kohanim and the Levim are only from the family of Tzadok. So you have this very narrow view of who's even fit to serve a Kohen, serve as a priest. And clearly, at the beginning, at least, this sect's leaders were Zadokites. It didn't mean other people couldn't join the sect, as we spoke about last week. There was a very intense initiation ritual, but the leadership, at least initially, comes from this high priestly family, feeling that they're really better fit to serve a community than the impure priests in Jerusalem, who are just making a mess out of the whole thing. And they're also going to be upset in 104. Aristobulus I, isn't that a great name, Aristobulus? I've heard it pronounced Aristobulus also, but he calls himself the king. He's a Hasmonean, a Maccabee. He's the high priest, but he also gives himself the king, which isn't just a problem for the Dead Sea sect. It's a problem for Jews in general, in the sense that he's not from the Davidic family. Most Jews would, outside of the Qumran sect, would say, okay, he could be a Kohen. He's from Aaron's family. He's a Hasmonean. That's all good and fine. But he has no business being a king from a religious point of view. But doesn't stop him. He has the power. He doesn't really live very long. However, his brother Alexander Jannaeus, and by the way, notice the Greek names here. One of the great ironies is the Hasmoneans fought to stop the over-Hellenization of Judea. You look at, let's say, 60, 70 years later, you have the basically the sons, the grandsons of the original Maccabees, have these Greek-sounding names, even though Jannaeus is really Yonatan, which is Hebrew, but Alexander, clearly Greek.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Would you go back to the slide before? Were you going to cover that little piece on, I think it was Ezekiel, well, that's the American name, the one before the last one.
Well, Ezekiel, so Ezekiel, what I was saying was the Dead Sea sect believed that only people from Sadok, the priest during the time of Solomon, could serve as a high priest. So there's a Haftorah from Yehezkel, Ezekiel, where he says that who are the Kohanim, the very sons of Sadok. So he seems,
I see.
Ezekiel, Yehezkel, was a priest himself.
Right.
He was prophesizing to the exilic community right after the Jews were exiled into Babylon. He actually is exiled in the first wave of exiles, the first exilic wave in 593, even before the temple is destroyed, when the Babylonians tried to exile the leadership in hopes that if they cut off the leadership of the people, the Jews would stop revolting against them, because most revolutions are led by people who are up on the top. Think of the American Revolution. These people were either, most of them are rich and leading intellectuals. You think about Jefferson and figures like that. So obviously that didn't work, and they kept revolting. He's prophesizing to the exilic community in Babylon, and he's already starting to think about, and then the temple is destroyed, and he's starting to think about a second temple. And he seems to imagine who are the priests supposed to be. They're supposed to not be anyone who's from Aaron's family, but only those from the family of Sadok. So that's why I had his name down there. Does that help? I think that was Susan.
I'm sorry. I knew that he wrote during that period. I just didn't know how you were applying it. So I apologize.
No, that's fine. So I hope that helps.
Rabbi?
Yeah, Scott.
Right. So Rabbi, I know you have more coming here, but I think, you mentioned the wicked priest, you mentioned 152, you mentioned these Essenes are operating in this Maccabean period, but a lot of those phrases, the wicked priests, they also have connotations that could be applied to a later period. And in fact, a lot of the sectarian documents that we're going to talk about, or I think you're going to talk about here, also have applicability in a later period. And in fact, if we are to assume that these Essenes wrote these things during the Maccabean period, the assumption is they didn't have anything else to say when Herod takes Jerusalem, or when Herod marries the last remaining Maccabean descendant, Miriam, or when he forces the Kohanim to make a sacrifice in the temple in the name of Caesar every day as a concession to keep the Jews from having to worship the Caesar. And then he murders Miriam, and then he murders his two sons, and then he goes on to have other marriages that are questionable, and his own heritage is not, whether he's even Jewish or not. And yet the sectarians are talking about, they talk about three nets that ensnare the children of Israel: hone, money, zanut, fornication, and Tamei HaMikdash, desecration of the temple. And although we could say, yeah, during the Maccabean period, there may have been some desecration of the temple, this idea of fornication and zanut has no real applicability to the Maccabees, but it sure has applicability to Herod and all of his descendants.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So let me just clarify, because I said it, but let me clarify. So there's a suggestion this wicked high priest who is unnamed may be Jonathan. It's also possible he's from a later period. So I'm not saying, or Schiffman is not saying it is Jonathan, the Maccabean high priest. It's just one of the several possibilities. So we're going to get to Herod a little bit more today, and then some of the other things you mentioned, Scott, we'll get to in the next few lectures. Okay, but that's a good point. So let's make that clear about the wicked high priest. Maybe Yonatan, it may be someone else, as we're going to see with Herod's outlandish behavior, and he was certainly paranoid, and he may have been mimicking some of the crazy things that went on in Rome with their Roman type of parties. The Essenes, and particularly the Qumran sect, are not going to be impressed with this type of behavior. Remember, these are people that really specialize in purity. So when they think about Roman orgies and those type of things, they're going to be disgusted by them.
But the point I really want to make here is where the Schiffman is assuming that the Essenes were prolific writers in the Hasmonean period, and they're going to all go silent when Herod comes on the scene. And that's the implication Schiffman and these other Dead Sea Scroll scholars are making you follow, is that if we shift everything back in time, these Essenes or these Dead Sea Scroll people, or whoever they were, had nothing to say when some of the most momentous events in Jewish history leading up to the destruction of the temple is occurring. Schiffman and these other scholars want you to believe, well, they had nothing to say about it. And that's what becomes so hard to accept with a lot of what we're talking about with the Maccabean. They probably had to do with, the Essenes were mad at the Maccabees. Say what you want about the Maccabees, but they were Jewish. Herod and his descendants, I don't even think they were Jewish, let alone related to the line of David. And I would think that the Essenes, who were strict Torah observers, are going to have a lot to say about Herod and Agrippa I and Agrippa II that are much later in time, that really does go to this point of a day of judgment, that they really see they're being overwhelmed by the Roman interference in Judaism, as opposed to the Maccabees, who, although they usurped the kingdom, they were nowhere near the level of evil and depravity that Herod and all of his people were at that time in the lead up to the temple's destruction. And a lot of, we talk about that wicked priest, but there's other characters more than a wicked priest that have a lot more applicability to the later period than they do to the Maccabean period.
Okay, so you're right. In the sense that scholars argue, and you're referring to particularly the guy you studied his works in, I forgot his name, in California.
Robert Eisenman.
Eiserman goes for a later dating. What you're talking.
Right, and he has no agenda. He's not religious, whereas Schiffman is Orthodox, and he does have a certain agenda he's going to try to protect or try to skew. Eisenman doesn't have that. He's just stepping back and looking at the documents as they are, whether they're pro-Jewish or anti-Jewish. And that we have to always keep that in mind when we talk about these scholars, when they promote these ideas of when they think the documents are.
Mhm.
Putting them in the Maccabean period puts them in a safe spot. They're going to avoid a lot of controversy, which isn't, that's not the way a scholar's supposed to work. He's supposed to look at it as the documents and the words apply to the period and see if there's similarities with periods or with
Mhm.
personalities or with groups of people that had these kind of views or these kind of deprived acts, and what they would be so vehemently trying to protest against, like this idea of fornication. Why would they be saying that against the Maccabees? The Maccabees and their descendants were known to do that kind of stuff, but Herod sure was.
Okay, so that's a good point. So we'll keep that in mind as we go through. There are differences, the scholarly differences.
So can I clarify something that Scott said?
Yes.
What you're saying, Scott, is that this one scholar is talking about the Maccabee, or this period of the Essenes being early, and the other scholar is talking about being later. And I guess, Rabbi, that you're going to cover some of the stuff with the fact that the Sadducees were also as the high I'm going to say priests, or the heads of the temple, that they were basically collaborating with the Romans at the time. Is that true also? So is that part of this story? I mean, it seems to me.
So if you actually, I'm going to start covering that in the next couple of
Okay,
slides.
yeah.
But just to clarify, I think the issue isn't when we're talking about not necessarily when the Essenes or these groups came on the scene. That's seems to be like in the 140s or so, 150s, 140s before the Common Era. The issue is, when particularly do you date these texts? Do these texts, are they earlier, or, as Scott is arguing, could some of them be later, being that you would expect that the Qumran sect would have something to say with all the goings on in the court of Herod and some of the strange things that went on there. So it's really a question of, is that fair, Scott?
You got it. That's great. Good summary.
Okay,
nice,
good.
Susan, right.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, so first of all, Alexander Jannaeus, or Alexander Yonatan, he takes over as the high priest and king. He is close with the Essenes. Look at the date here, 104, 76, so he has a long reign. The Essenes like him. They did find among the Qumran library a blessing for King Yonatan found among the scrolls. This may be a reference to him. We don't know for sure. Not particularly surprising if you think about, we have a prayer for the state that we say, it's in our siddur, we say it every Shabbat as well. So it wouldn't be particularly surprising that they had this here.
Rabbi, when you say he's close to the Essenes, what's that mean? In time or in?
No, political allies.
Okay, so they knew each other? Is that what
they were political. When I say close, they were basically, think of the Essenes as a religious / political movement, and their allies, politically speaking. All the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes would often jockey for power and influence. They want to influence in the court of the king, and the Essenes seem to be in during that time period. Does that make sense, Sam?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. After he dies, you have Salome Alexandra, the queen. She rules as queen. The rabbis seem to like her, basically. She seems to be very benign and does a good job running the show there. After she dies, she has her two sons, Hyrcanus II, and we have another Aristobulus II, vie for power. They have the bright idea of asking Pompey and Rome to settle the dispute, and Pompey marches his soldiers in and uses this civil war between the two brothers as an excuse to conquer Jerusalem in 63, and that's the end of the second independent Jewish state. Okay, and Hyrcanus II winds up becoming Pompey's puppet. and has a relatively long run because he has the support of Rome there. Now, to Scott's point about dating the scrolls, according to Schiffman, there's occasional reference to the arrival of Rome. Could there be other places in the scrolls where you may argue that there are other coded references to the arrival of Rome? Possibly, but you do have, even by Schiffman's datings of the scrolls, you do have occasional references to the beginning of Rome starting to come in, which starts in 63. And the Romans are referred to as the Kittim, which is originally Cyprus in the Torah. This is simply a code name for Rome, where they want to talk about Rome, and if the Romans get scrolls and they say to something, or they write a letter negatively about Rome, this is written in code as a way of protecting themselves. The rabbis use Bavel. The Babylonians later, they'll sometimes talk about Rome. Bavel. It's code, just so they don't get caught. Okay, so then I lost that last bullet point here. Let me just back up. Let me see if I could get out this way. I can't see okay, I'll move on. I can't see my last bullet point. So let's move on to Herod here, who Scott had mentioned. So Herod's father was an influential figure up in the north. As Scott also mentioned, his family was forced to convert to Judaism under Hyrcanus I, who was the nephew of Judah the Maccabee, who rules about 130 or so before the Common Era. So Herod's family is forced to convert to Judaism about 2 generations before. His father becomes an influential politician up in the north. And Herod marries himself into the Hasmonean family as a way of gaining power, and then convinces the Roman Senate to make him king of Judah. So he becomes a client king, as Scott also mentioned. He killed his Hasmonean wife and 2 Hasmonean sons, feeling that they were a threat. He was paranoid, and he really thought they were conspiring against him. Probably they were not conspiring against him, but it didn't stop him. He executed so many of his own family members. It's Augustus Caesar who permitted some of the executions, remarked it's better to be Herod's pig than his son, because he doesn't kill his pigs, just his own kids. Okay, so he has Antigonus executed. So Antigonus was the son, if you remember, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II were vying for power, and they invite Pompey into to try to mediate it, and Pompey takes control, and Hyrcanus II winds up being Pompey's puppet for a while. Antigonus, the son of Aristobulus II, is basically vying for power, and the rabbis consider him to be really the true Maccabee, in the sense that he had the Maccabean spirit, just as the Maccabees were fighting to liberate Judea from the Greek control. He's fighting to try to liberate it from Roman control. He doesn't want to be a puppet like his brother. But Herod, who's in league with the Romans and ruling at the behest of the Romans, has Antigonus executed as well. Okay, so according to Schiffman, we don't really have a direct mention of Herod in the scroll, either because Qumran was insular or because most of the text antedate Herod. Now, to Scott's point, are some of these texts indirectly talking about Herod? Are they using Herod code names for Herod, just as they use code names for Romans? Certainly possible. Scott, does Eiserman say that Herod is directly being referred to, even though not by name?
Yeah, he makes hints at it, but again, Qumran, as they all do, nobody's referred to by name, but they do hint. They do hint at at rulers. They call them. He refers to him as the the people's king. I think they use phraseology from the Torah that kind of refers to Herod. They always use texts from the Torah and something about the people's king, they say. The people's king, but never by name, definitely not by name.
Okay, so that makes the point Scott was saying before. It's certainly possible, and Professor Eisenman certainly believes that Herod is being indirectly referred to, even though he doesn't appear by name. Okay. So in the year 6 of the Common Era, Rome basically annexes Judah outright. Up until then, it had been a satellite of Rome. Now it's just annexed. What had happened is Herod's son Archelaus, who was ruling most of his father's kingdom, made such a mess of the whole thing. They simply had to depose him from power, and they ruled through these prefects, which are these governors, the most famous being Pontius Pilate. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, and before we conclude here, now we're actually going a little beyond the Qumran sects. Well, actually, we're not beyond the Qumran sect yet, but we will get beyond there. So you have zealots emerge. Remember, the Qumran sect itself lasts till 68 of the Common Era, right before the temple is destroyed. So they're around when the zealots are agitating against Rome. The term has political and apocryphal overtones. In other words, they're fighting politically to free Judea from Roman rule. And they also see this, there's a certain messianic fever to a certain degree. You have more of that, quite honestly, in the later Great Revolt against Rome, led by Bar Kokhba in 132 of the Common Era. But you already have a bit of this. The world is coming to an end. This type of, and this was popular among the Essenes. Historians believe Jesus had an apocalyptic type of message as well. So this was relatively common during these times. And particularly during Pesach at the temple, the Romans were always very concerned about revolts, because if you think about Pesach, the message is Jewish freedom. So they're always afraid that a revolt was going to break out during that time. In 66, you do have the actual revolt against Rome breaks out. As we know, the temple is destroyed in 70. The Qumran sect is destroyed by the Romans 2 years earlier. And just to put things in historical context, Masada, which is right down the road, falls in 73. Shuls or synagogues really start to replace the Bet HaMikdash, the temple, as the place of Jewish worship. Now, you had synagogues sprouting up since the 3rd century BCE, even though they took on different roles. In some places, they were Torah study places. Other places, they were more of political, religious meeting houses. In other places, they were used for prayer. But after the destruction of the temple, they really become the primary vehicle for worship as opposed to the temple. And in 132, Bar Kokhba leads a revolt. It was actually a diaspora revolt against Rome as well, but the next major revolt is the Bar Kokhba revolt, 132 to 135. And Jews eventually are banned from living in Jerusalem as part of these Hadrianic persecutions, which most scholars believe these persecutions were a result of the Jews revolting against Rome as opposed to what led to the revolt against Rome. So ultimately, the Galil or the Galilee becomes the center of Jewish life, being that Jerusalem and the general area around Jerusalem is off limits to Jews, at least for a period of time. So the next lecture we're going to talk about, we're going to do more of this background, but we're going to start focusing more particularly on the Sadducees, Pharisees, and Essenes. There are different outlooks, and that's going to help us get a look at what exactly the Qumran sect, who are they, and the other sects that they were interacting with, who they are reacting to in some of their writings. So let me exit out of the screen share, and we'll go into Q&A.
So, Rabbi, another thing it popped into my mind that Avi and I learned from that class we went to, or that program we saw,
Right.
was that what do they call it? The shepherd, or I guess it's called shepherds, the one that found the original scrolls. Someone had interviewed him, and he didn't know what they were, so he took them to some market quite a distance away. I believe it was in a Muslim land too. But anyway, and he didn't know, and he asked that person what it was. It happened to be a sandal maker. And so in exchange for giving him the scrolls, he got a pair of sandals.
Oh, okay. I didn't hear that part. Schiffman says that he sold the scrolls for $125, which obviously, had he known how important these were, he would have held out for a lot more. But $125 and a pair of shoes. It didn't exactly work out too well for him. Okay. Thank you for sharing that, Lydia. Fascinating. Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, Rabbi, I have a question. You
Marty.
talked about Ezra and Nehemiah being like about 450 or 5, I think it was 450 BCE.
Yes, correct.
And the
correct.
temple was rebuilt at 520 BCE. But I thought Ezra and Nehemiah were responsible for getting the temple built. So
No, I'll explain that. They're really responsible for Herod's really glorifies the physical structure, despite Herod's Meshuggah behavior. What he basically did is he basically tore down the second temple and rebuilt it. So instead of being a modest looking facility or structure, it became a very grandiose looking structure. He really had the Temple Mount elevated artificially to even more than it was. But your question with Ezra and Nehemiah. So what happened was the second temple is built in various stages. Cyrus tells the Jews they can go back to Persia, let's say 540, 539. A very small group first under Shalmaneser, who's from the house of David, leads them back. Then Zerubbabel, also from the house of David, takes over. And they build, initially they basically just build a little altar there, and we're told it's very dramatic. We're told in the book of Ezra, the old people who remembered the first temple cried. They thought it was so pathetic. They remember the great temple of Solomon, this grandiose structure, and here they have a pathetic little altar. But the young people don't remember Solomon's temple, so they're excited because it's something, it's a beginning, at least it's a start. So they're excited. But then we're unsure of the reason why, but there's an 18-year period where the temple building is halted. So historians have pieced it together as best they can and feel what most likely happens is the Samaritans who are living in the general area wanted to participate in the building of the temple. And when they asked the Jews returning from Babylon, could we help participate in the temple? The Jewish authorities said, well, you have some Jewish customs and traditions, but also have customs and traditions which aren't Jewish. You're not really Jewish. Sorry, you can't help us. So the thought is that they probably protested, being rejected, they protested to the Persians saying, if you let the Jews build this temple, they'll declare independence. So and this actually story does appear in the books, in the later books of Ketuvim, these writings. However, the dating is very problematic. So historians are trying to piece together what's happening here. But what is clear, in the year 520, Darius II, who the Persian king, allows the Jews to finish rebuilding the temple. That 18-year hiatus comes to an end. The Jews, actually, the prophet Haggai says to the Jews, go to Persia and lobby the king, the new king, and see if he'll let you rebuild the temple. He says to the Jews of Jerusalem, you're sitting in your fancy paneled homes with your flat screen TVs, living large, shall we say, and God's house is in ruins. It's basically a pathetic little altar with a tent type of thing. So just the way you go to Washington, when I go to AIPAC, let's say, to lobby, something like that, you go to Washington to share your concerns. So they lobby, and Darius II is amenable, and he tells the Jews they could finish rebuilding their temple. According to the Talmud, by the way, who is Darius II's mother? Purim is coming. I'll give you a hint.
Queen Esther.
Esther. So according to the Talmud, this is the son of Achashverosh and Esther. but historically speaking, we know he does for sure let the Jews go back. They rebuild the temple. It really takes them about 5 years. Then in 515, they inaugurate the second temple. But Nehemiah comes, I believe it's the year 444, and really enhances Jerusalem as a city as well. He seems to be the governor. He seems to be the governor, but he's also a religious man. He has a wall built. There's a flare up again with the Samaritans, where people as they're building this wall to defend Jerusalem, they have to protect themselves from being attacked by the Samaritans as well, who are still angry at them for rejecting them. And Ezra comes, who is a Kohen himself, but however, he actually has a falling out with the Kohanim, and he's really responsible for the democratization, really a beginning of a democratization of Judaism, where he has this public reading of the Torah, and he's a scribe. Ezra HaSofer, he's a scribe as well, and really seems to diminish the power of the Kohanim and open Judaism up more to the laity as well. It talks about him celebrating Rosh Hashanah and delving into the Torah to find meaning, which is really a way of saying that the period of prophecy is coming to an end. So how are we going to hear God's voice now? Not by simply having God speak to a prophet. We're going to have to work a little harder. You're going to have to be a Talmud Chacham, shall we say, a Torah scholar, and this is the way you're going to figure out or hear God's voice, by studying Torah. So there you have while they don't build a second temple, it's already there. They really establish the ambiance of Jewish political and religious life and strengthen it tremendously. And they strengthen it, and by the time, and then after that the Greeks come in 331 with Alexander. Good question, Marty. Any other questions or comments?